they would love people to come in and talk about your experiences at the conference so far. So maybe you could start your resistance diaries through video, right? Right? We're on to our second panel, and first one was so amazing. Thank you again. Second panel is called Beyond the Non-Non-Nons.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's someone who knows what that means. Challenging policies of endless punishment and the narratives of, quote, violent criminals and, quote, dangerous communities. Our moderator is somebody who probably needs no introduction, but Glenn Martin, who's the founder and president of Just Leadership. It's amazing to have Glenn here. And the panelists are just another stunning array that whom Glenn will introduce, but I just want to do a personal welcome home to my friend Aisha Elliott, whom I haven't seen in a long time. You're on, Glenn.
Thank you, Michelle. Good morning. Packed house. Glad to be back here. Love the energy in this space. So I've been given a ton of guidance, mostly between the elevator and when I walked in this room. So I'm going to try to get this right. I'm actually going to probably read this piece word for word so I don't get it wrong. Governor Cuomo plans to reduce visiting hours at New York State's maximum security prison. Join us in opposing those cutbacks. So folks are asking for you to call Governor Cuomo. Can folks pull out a pen really quickly and just jot down the governor's number? And maybe you text him, tweet to him, whatever you got to do. The number's 518. Ready? 518-474-8390. Tell him who you are, where you live, why you care, and that he should not be cutting back visits in state prisons. Please. Thank you. So let's get started. The great thing about being a moderator is you don't have to say anything really smart. I am so tired of being on the panel. I am actually really pleased to be the person here, just sort of keeping the conversation going. So little about me, little about Just Leadership, little about the Close Rikers campaign, and more about the folks who are sitting here who are going to give us a chance to engage in a very important conversation. One that's been important for me since I came home from prison 15 years ago, because I found myself in advocacy spaces telling policymakers that we shouldn't be causing this sort of harm to nonviolent first-time drug offenders who were convicted of marijuana and are spending 20 years in prison. Like, what the fuck? Like, I'm sitting there telling people that folks like me probably deserve to be under the bus. And that was a really tough place for me to be 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. And so here we are today saying that we need to shake loose that narrative, and we need to come up with a narrative that puts value in all people, that shows that all people have space to redeem themselves, to transform themselves, and to emerge from our criminal justice system having repaired the harm that they've caused and having created a space to deal with the trauma that for most people got them involved in the criminal justice system in the first place. We had a planning call for this event. We talked about how our criminal justice system has used language and tools and policies to dehumanize folks, to demonize people, particularly people who have violent crimes, sex offenders, and increasingly lately anyone who has a domestic violence-related conviction. Those folks have become the pariah of our criminal justice system. And advocates have played into that narrative, and trying to find compassion from policymakers have been all too willing to throw this segment of the criminal justice system under the bus. And what's beautiful about it is that folks like the people in this room have been saying that we are no longer comfortable settling for incrementalism, and that we want reform that matches the scope of the problem that we've gotten ourselves into. And the problem is that you don't undo the mess that we've gotten ourselves into without, first of all, telling the truth about history and how we got here. The fact that we have over-criminalized everyone, not just nonviolent drug offenders. The fact that we have elongated sentences for everyone. The fact that we have criminalized behaviors that weren't criminal just 10, 15, 20 years ago. And if you really want to dig deep and undo this system, then you have to tell that truth. And that truth brings us to where we are today, which is a conversation about undoing the narrative that continues to get in the way of true reform. So I want to introduce our panelists. They all have really long bios. They all have done a lot of amazing things, whether it was in prison or since they've been released. I'm not going to read their entire bios. Just put your hand up for the audience as I say your name, please. Aisha Elliott, who was released on June 2nd, 2016. Welcome home. She served 25 years of a 25 to life sentence, every bit of that, using that time as an opportunity to better herself. She has a bachelor's degree of arts in sociology from Marymount Manhattan College. The list of programs she's participated in includes Down on Violence, Anger in You, Alternative to Violence Program, Aggression Replacement Training, and a number of others. In the future, she hopes to be an advocate and a voice for currently and formerly incarcerated women convicted of crimes. I would bet you're already that. Welcome. Danielle Ferrant, am I pronouncing that? Ferrante works as an educator and an administrator in a school for children diagnosed with autism for 20 years. She received her undergraduate degree in psychology and her master's in human services with a specialization in mental health counseling. More relevant to this conversation, she is the daughter of John McKenzie. Thank you for being with us. Does that name resonate with anyone in this audience? Yes. Yeah, can we get a little shout out for John, please? So John was a son, a brother, a father, a grandfather, as well as a man who was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. There's a lot more here on this bio, but I do not want to steal her thunder. It is her story. I'm going to let her tell it. Welcome, Danielle. Do I say Stephen or Humble or what do I say? Stephen Humble Manguel, depends on how well you know him. People call him Humble, is the Latino Affairs producer for On the Count. He holds an associate's degree in human services from Bronx Community College and a bachelor's degree in social work at Lehman College. He's worked as a case manager advocating for the HIV/AIDS population, was married in 2007, and has a 4-year-old son. He's a member of the National Boricua Human Rights Network, bringing awareness to the issue of Puerto Rican political prisoners and the colonial status of Puerto Rico. He was born and raised in the Bronx, and he's from New York City, Puerto Rican parents. At a very young age, he experienced a life of drugs, alcohol. I don't want to do this part. You do this part. That's your story. Welcome, Humble, to the conversation, please. And last but not least, we have Erica Miners, who's the author of several books, including The Right to Be Hostile. I love it. Schools, Prisons, and the Making of Public Enemies in 2009. And for the Children, which is the name of the other book, correct? Protecting Innocence in a Carceral State, University of Minnesota Press, 2016. And articles in wide range of publications, including Meridians, Women's Studies, Quarterly, Captive Genders, and In the Time. She's an active member of her labor union, University Professionals of Illinois. Bernard Brommel, Distinguished Research Professor at Northeastern Illinois University, a public open access university where she teaches classes of justice studies, education, and gender and sexuality studies, and is the recipient of numerous awards and grants. I can go on forever. I'm only about a third of the way through. I won't embarrass you anymore. So we're going to jump in. We're going to do about 7 minutes each, which means that each speaker has to be extremely disciplined. But as someone who normally sits on this side of it, I know what my responsibility is as a moderator when people go beyond that 7 minutes. So I'm going to be doing jumping jacks over here. 7 minutes for each. Q&A between the 5 of us, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. I promise I will make space for the audience to be part of this conversation. I know how important that is. So why don't we start? I think on the phone I suggested how we were going to start. The person I want to go, I think we decided you would go just before. You know what? Because we lost Andre, who was supposed to actually go last, I'm going to ask that we just go in order. Does that work? I'm mostly being protective here because I've heard some of these stories and I know where this is going to end up, and I have my Kleenex here under the podium. So we're going to support the people on this panel. There might be some really tough moments here, and if I'm not getting it right, help me get it right, folks. So let's start with Humble and just go straight across, please.
So thank you, Glenn, for the introduction. Thank you to the wonderful people who have put this together. Cheryl, good friend of mine, actually a mentor, as well as, of course, the one and only Kathy Boudin. Thank you. I really appreciate it. So I was convicted in 1994 of a manslaughter and assault. It was a homicide. And I just wanted to share a little bit about the backstory. So my oldest memory of my childhood growing up was watching my mother get into fights. I'm talking about the earliest memories that I can remember. Violence and drugs was in my household regularly. My mom struggled with drug and alcohol abuse. And so I remember I was maybe about 7 years old when she got into a fight with some girls and ran up in the house, grabbed a gun that belonged to my stepfather at the time, come outside and she's shooting. Mind you, I'm 7 years old, experiencing all of this stuff. She comes inside. A few minutes later, the cops come and arrest her. I'm crying. My two little sisters are crying. And I mean, it was just something that's horrific. So growing up, having violence around me, drugs and alcohol around me, it was just something that I saw to be just regular. You know, we think back in hindsight when we talk about, this so-called, dysfunctional family, it was just something normal to me. And so being 12 and 13 and getting involved in drugs and alcohol, at the epidemic of the crack era, which is where I grew up, it was just a natural progression. At 19 years old, mind you, I had already been arrested probably like 4 times. I had, stop and frisk and all of that craziness. At 19 years old, my sister that followed me, she decides to take my mother with her over to Dominican Republic where she was staying so she could get her clean. My mom had already lost her apartment. She was already strung out on crack at that time. This was 1991. So I drive my mother to the airport the last time I seen her, 1991, July 25th. And I said my goodbyes, and little did I know, 7 days later, she would die in a horrible car accident with my 17-year-old sister. So I'm 19 years old. I'm in the street. I'm already using drugs. I'm getting high. I'm selling drugs. And I just pretty much gave up on life. A year later, 1992, two of my friends supposed friends that I grew up with tell me, listen, there's somebody who is cutting our throat around the corner who is a rival drug dealer, and we're going to have to go step to him. And they knew that if they asked me, it was like I was already where, probably one of the reasons I didn't commit suicide was because I was a coward and I wouldn't. So, but I remember putting myself in situations where bullets would be flying all over the place. And so it was just something that was normal to me. So he takes me inside his house and he gives me a gun. He gives a gun to his friend, another guy. So the three of us walk down there. This is November 2nd, 1992. I remember it was drizzling. It was dark. And we see this guy standing in front of the store selling drugs. And they're like, that's him. We pull out our guns and just commence the shooting. We all run. And the very next day, I get arrested. The other two guys didn't get arrested because their faces weren't known. The eyewitness that was there at the time was only able to point me out. And so November 3rd, 1992, I wind up getting arrested and spend a year and a half in Rikers Island, copped out to 8 to 24 as a first-time felony offender. And the whole time I was in prison, I thought about how I could have made that day different, the different choices, the different decisions that I could have made. Of course, in hindsight, facing all of this time at the time. November 2nd, 1992 was the worst day of my life. I think about this every single day. This is 25 plus years later. I think about the mother of my victim. I hate to say victim, but the survivor of this horrible act. And her having to go and identify her son. And that's something that you just can't not think about. I was blessed to meet some exceptional people during my prison incarceration. And that journey introduced me to some really, people who changed my life. One of them being part of Eddie Ellis's and Larry Luke White uh, non-traditional approach to new prison movement. These are people that survived the Attica Rebellion. And when I became a part of that movement, it just changed my life. I got into the college program. I was able to get 2 college semesters prior to the tap and Pell being taken away from us. And my life has just never been the same. This was 1994, 1995. And I just fell in love with struggle, fell in love with social justice, understood that my life was supposed to be dedicated now to giving back because I owe a debt to my community. I owe a debt to my society. And I'm here today because I've met some really exceptional people. And I'm hoping that for the rest of my life, I will continue in this struggle to give back because I owe a debt. I will always owe a debt. And everything that I do is because of the men that I've met and the women that I've met who have influenced and mentored me. And I'm here standing before you as someone who was not able to benefit from any of the positive programs in prison because I was a so-called violent criminal. And so I was sentenced to a minimum of 8 and wind up doing 14 years. I was denied parole 3 times strictly because of the nature of my crime. And yet, I believed, and I still believe, that I deserved human being to be treated as a human being, as many of our brothers and sisters who are in prison right now, to be given a second chance, to be able to live a life of hope. And I today am here sitting before you, someone who is living the life of redemption and atonement with everything that I do, taking responsibility and not making any excuses because I was guilty of what I did. And I'm hoping that with my story, I can share with all of you and hopefully change some hearts and minds. And with that, I just wanted to thank you.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you for sharing your story. I know how difficult it is to share your story with an audience, but to do it repeatedly. And I think that you have done it in the service of moving us all forward as a field. I'm going to come back to you and ask a question, as I'm going to ask most of the folks here a question. And my question to you is, when I asked you to open up and to address this issue of violence and the narrative, you went from here's what I did all the way back to your childhood immediately, and then sort of walked us through all of that and did it in 7 minutes, actually. So I'm going to ask you, when I come back to you, is you talked about yourself as both victim and offender through that story, and it was really hard to sort of keep up with the different roles you were playing. So what does a criminal justice system looks like that creates a space for someone like you who've harmed someone to repair that harm? Because I didn't hear a whole lot about the victim of the crime having a space for that harm to be repaired, or for you to play a role there. And then what does a criminal justice system equally look like that allows for enough space for you to share in the process the trauma that you experienced that led you up to that moment? So easy question. I'll get back to you. So Aisha, you're up next. Oh gosh.
My makeup's kind of cheap. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Missy and Kathy and Glenn and everyone else for being here. Have microphones in prison.
We don't have microphones in prison.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Missy and Kathy and Glenn and everyone else that is here. My name is Aisha, and as Glenn said, I came home in June from serving 25 years for a very violent crime, which was second-degree murder. And violence in my life started at a very early age, although in retrospect, I didn't realize that it was considered violence. We got beatings every day for everything from going off the porch to writing on the walls or getting in after the street lights came on. But that was just, like Humble said, it was normal. That is what Black women did. They whipped their kids when they did something that they had no business doing. But that is violence, and I didn't realize that until I was older and educated and was able to identify it as violence. In addition to the beatings, excuse me, I have a pretty large family. There are 4 girls and 4 boys, and I was considered the ugly one out of everyone. So I grew up believing that I was very ugly, and I turned to the streets as a teenager to find the love that I felt like I wasn't getting at home. I started selling drugs, and I was one of the for a minute I was the only female in that small town that was selling drugs. So I got the love from the men that I was looking for that I wasn't getting at home. When you sell drugs, you're carrying guns, you're doing a lot of things that you have absolutely no business doing, and that leads you to a life of violence. You're selling drugs. You have to fight people. You have to beat people up. You can't let people get over on you. There's so much stupid shit that you have to do. It's ridiculous, and that led to my crime: hanging out in the streets, carrying weapons, transporting guns for different drug dealers. You can't tell on anybody, so if you get caught with it, it's your gun. That's the bottom line. And although I was attacked first that night, well, let me just say that unless someone commits suicide, their death is never their fault. So let me just get that out there, and then I was attacked. The girl, I don't even know if I'm allowed to use their name. I hate to call her a victim.
You should decide what language makes you feel comfortable.
Okay. Tasha stabbed me, and she went away, and people told her, leave Aisha alone. The only thing I did was sold drugs, made money, went to the mall, didn't save a penny, but this is what I do. And she came back, and she stabbed me again. And the first time she cut me in my arm, and it wasn't such a big deal to me. I didn't think, I'm going to get her back. Never thought that. I thought, okay, you need to go get stitched up before your boyfriend sees it, and you don't know what's going to happen. But she came back out, and then she stabbed me in my head. And then she stabbed me in my head a second time. And there was a friend of mine in the crowd who felt like I was in trouble, so he handed me a knife, and I stabbed her, which turned out to be fatal. It was not my intention to kill anyone, but it did happen. I used to think that it was going to be one of us, but in retrospect, it didn't have to be either one of us. I didn't even have to be out there. Where's my tissue, Glenn? Thank you. It's fancy. And some of these, it's iconic. It was I don't know how many of you have been to, well, I'm sure some of you have been to block parties. It's just massive amounts of people. It was like the Greek Olympic Games or something. They see two black girls in the streets fighting with weapons, and they're cheering you on, not realizing what's getting ready to happen. It became a problem when they saw blood. It shouldn't have gone that far. They are not responsible for her death. I am, but you don't encourage two young black people to stab each other to death. You just don't do that as a responsible citizen of any community that you're in. Ridiculous. Okay, so she died. I did not know she had died because she was still up screaming about killing me when I left. But the way I saw it was that with the system that oppress us in prison and outside of prison, they felt like, okay, we have one black girl dead. We have one black girl doing 25 to life. That's two niggers out of our hair. So nobody really cared. Nobody gave a damn that these, two lives were ruined, and it trickles into everyone in her family and everyone in my family as well. So the system is horrible. The system is messed up, and there was no concern or no voices saying we need to fix this. The only thing they were thinking was, well, we need to bury her and we need to send her to prison. Let's just bury both of them. They're just going to be in two different places. When I got to prison, I immediately thought about getting out of prison. I said, you're going to get out of jail one day, so do everything you need to do so when that time comes, you'll get out. I was arrested in 91. I went to prison in 92. I received my GED in 93. I started college in 94. It was gone in 95, and I had it back in 96. So myself and 5 other women were on the committee, and we are responsible for hundreds of women in prison getting their education. And one of those women is Kathy Boudin and her co-defendant, Judy Clark, who I hope they definitely release. But I was in prison for about 8 years when I realized the seriousness of what had happened and how I really needed to prepare myself to get out. And I started saying, I'm going to make my first parole board. I'm not getting hit at the board. I don't care what they do. I'm just not getting hit at the board. Turns out that I did not get hit at the board. And I was right way back then. I just wish that every other person that has life on the back of their sentence can say the same, and it actually happens for them as well. That's another issue that I would like to be a voice for them. They need help with parole prep. That's a major issue. I understand the family opposition. You know, you've committed a crime. They want you to just drop dead in prison. The law doesn't say I have to do that, so I'm not going to sit back and let it happen. I don't need to drop dead in prison. The judge gave me 25 years. I should be released after that. The district attorneys, they like to oppose your release as well. Don't oppose it. You got me 25 years. You did your part. Stand back and let me get out of prison. We're not even going to get into the district attorney. But Glenn talked about the different programs that I did that had to do with violence. I didn't feel like I was a violent person, and I did those programs because the state said I had to do them. And I sat in each one of those groups, and I don't know if they get funding for it, but it's a crock of shit. Doesn't do anything for you. It doesn't teach you how to be nonviolent. The anti-violent programs, the drug programs in there, it's all, to me, it seems like a scam. They have drug counselors facilitating ASAT, nodding and scratching their balls. That's not helping anybody. So the programs that are in prison are not working. There's nothing corrective about the entire system. It's just a bunch of hogwash. It's ridiculous. It's not going to help anybody stop being violent. If anything, prison makes you more violent. It teaches you the most ridiculous things. If you went to prison and you were not a thief, you get hungry, you say, can I have a slice of bread? They say no, so you steal a whole loaf. It just teaches you things that you wouldn't even have dreamed of doing before you went to prison. There's no corrections. There's no fixing it. It just shouldn't exist. It's ridiculous. You just cannot be fixed. And I hope I said everything I was supposed to say.
Thank you. So again, thank you for sharing your story. But your story is not all that you have to offer, obviously. And you reminded me of a trip I took to Rikers this week. I toured Rikers for about 5 hours with a few of my colleagues and some other opinion leaders very deliberately so that people outside of New York can see this torture island that we have in our backyard. And after this amazing tour that felt so well choreographed, we were followed around by 5 black SUVs, the mayor's office, a bunch of other folks. I realized that I only saw about 110 people locked up in a facility that has over 8,000 people. And so it was clear for me that it was very choreographed. But at the end of the tour, after the commissioner showed me all the amazing things they were doing at Rikers, I asked him 2 questions. And one was, if your wife was locked up, where would you want her to be? One of my colleagues actually asked him that question, and he said, not here. That was pretty powerful. And then I also said to him, you know, you say you guys have stopped solitary for children, but I'm hearing that you're shackling children to desks. And what's that all about? And he started to talk about this small group of violent children. And the fact that he took the word violent and put it alongside children and married the two and turned it into a thing was troubling for me as someone who knows that violence is extremely situational for human beings, and we all have the power to do a tremendous amount of good and a tremendous amount of bad. And so my question to you when I get back to you is going to be, if you were having a discussion with the family, the loved ones of the person whose life you took, in the middle of that situation 25 years ago when they were searching for answers, what would that conversation sound like? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about that. And then I'll get back to you, Aisha. But thank you for sharing your story with us. Let's keep going, please. Danielle, please.
Hi, everyone. So I'm here to talk about my father, John McKenzie. I am one of his 2 daughters, but I'm here representing for both of us. I'm going to try my best, so please bear with me. This is not my story. I'm here to tell his story for him as best I can. My father was in prison. He was incarcerated. But in order to kind of meet the theme of this, changing the narrative, I thought it would be better to talk about him as a person first. rather than just the label that he became for his whole entire life. So my father was born out of wedlock, single mother. She was a waitress. He had 3 brothers and sisters. 2 of them were given up for adoption when they were born, and he was left with one remaining brother who was horrible to him. He teased him, he bullied him, he picked on him, like the kind of brother just walk by and smack you in the back of the head kind of thing. And unfortunately, his mother was similar to my father. She neglected him. She often left him home alone or with neighbors. Back then, she would leave him at convents, I guess served as orphanages, kind of. He actually was given the name homing pigeon, like a nickname, because he would always run away and find his way back home to his mom. Just desperately searching for that love and affection from her that he never ever received. He thought that maybe he could win her over by providing for her, by becoming the man in the house. Sorry, I forgot to mention. His father passed away at the age of 23. He had never met his father. So he thought maybe if he could fill this role that she would, reciprocate the love that he was trying to give her. In order to do that, he began stealing. And from what I've heard, not to make light of it, he was a very good thief. He was very crafty in his thievery. But the thing my father was looking for his whole entire life was a family. Love, a family. He wanted people to love him. He wanted people to love. He just wanted that family that he never had. So in search of that, my father met 3 very significant women in his life. He actually met many women. He was kind of a good-looking guy. But 3 that stood out. He had 2 marriages, 2 children, 2 divorces. And the third would be considered his common law wife and later his accomplice. So despite his troubled childhood, he really was a very gentle, caring soul. Sorry. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
It's all right.
He loved nature. He loved animals. His friends tell me funny stories. He saved a sick squirrel, brought him home, and nursed him back to health. He would be made fun of by his friends, and there's even supposedly stories of saving bugs. So he really took it to another level. He loved nature so much. Fast forward to one of his transfers from prison to prison, he begged and actually convinced one of the guards to let him just touch a tree. He just wanted to touch the tree and be in tune with nature again. He was an artist. He was creative. He was a poet, a drummer, a photographer. He would often send us his daughter's homemade cards and poetry, and I still have those as very cherished memorabilia from him. And everyone always comments on his positive outlook and his sense of humor, that he really was a beacon of light for the people that he came into contact with. He was also very smart. Over the course of his years, even when in his troubled childhood, he maintained superior academic standing. I actually have report cards to prove it. He was made the dean's list a few times. And so he did earn 3 degrees over the course of his life, and he became similarly really dedicated to learning the legal system and law, and in order to help himself and others. And from what I've heard from a lot of people, he was always there, willing to help anyone at any time, give advice, any resources, anything he could do to help anybody in need. He also sought out troubled youth, people who shared similar experiences to his. And and tried to teach them how to be accountable for their actions, and to better themselves for themselves, to have that intrinsic motivation to be the best people that they could be. He became a positive male role model for many that didn't have that. I have to take a sip of water. I'm so sorry. So now that you've heard all the wonderful things about my father, on to the existing narrative. In 1975, my mother walked into a bakery and saw my father getting arrested on TV. He, the night before, with his common law wife, decided to rob a boutique. They were piling clothes into a car. He was passing them through the window. She was putting them into the trunk when two police officers approached her and began asking her questions. My father, hearing this, tried to leave out of the front door. And as he was running out, a uniformed police officer was walking in. My father shot him. About 2 months later, Matthew Giglio passed away after a lot of pain and suffering, and he left behind 3 young children. My father was sentenced to 25 years to life. After his first few years in prison, I'm so sorry. He realized that he needed to take responsibility for his actions. And from that moment on, he decided that he was going to prove to everybody that he was truly remorseful for what he had done and that he could live in the larger society, not only living, following rules and regulations, but potentially having a huge impact on children who are in similar situations to his. In 2000, he became eligible for parole. He was denied. He was a cop killer. That's what my father became. Every 2 years, my father came up for parole. He was denied. And the reason given was based on his initial crime. And I've read all of these transcripts and excuses. And after everything that is said, they will always go back to your initial crime shows that you have a disregard for the law. My father turned 70 this summer, and he also experienced his 10th parole denial. My father hung himself from the window bars and just couldn't go on anymore. He could never outlive the label that he was. Everybody deserves a second chance. In some meeting I came to with all these amazing people that I've met, somebody said something that really stuck out to me. And I'm paraphrasing. Imagine being judged your entire life by the worst mistake you've ever made. Here in America, everyone deserves a second chance. And I hope with everyone else that we can start to change the narrative.
Yeah. Thank you. That was your first time sharing that story publicly, correct? That was a gift to the rest of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to come back to you and I'm going to ask you a question. And your father didn't just kill himself. He killed himself to send a message. And if we had a chance to listen to him today, I'd like to hear from you what you think that message was that he was sending, not just to this audience, but to the world. I'll come back to you. Erica?
I'm really humbled to be here with such fierceness in the room and with the folks on the panel and the conversations this morning. I'm going to talk today about movements to end sexual violence, but specifically about how this requires challenging the category of sex offender and the increasing array of legal restrictions and social stigmas attached to people with convictions for sex offenses. But before I sketch out why it's so important to reject this isolation of people with convictions for sex offenses from our movements to challenge the prison nation, and to build movements to end sexual violence outside of the criminal legal system, I want to name a key context and for many a key tension for this work. I know many in the room spend our lives surviving, being resilient, strategic, and we can name those who did not make it, who were not meant to survive, to use Audre Lorde's phrase. We learned the hard way never to take a ride home from the boss, the pussy grabber. We figured out how to stand on the train or which relatives to never be alone with, or how to explain how we lost our virginity. Many of us got practiced in explaining long sleeves in summer to strangers and flinches or tics to lovers. And for some of us, it feels so hard to be asked again or to be told, to be the ones to grow, to move, to shift. It feels again like someone is telling us not to be angry, to forgive, to let go, to move on. Yet other of us know that there's never been anything to hold on to except our fierce sisters. Social workers or well-meaning teachers or police created more problems, fewer solutions. There was never any promise of support or care. Therefore, letting go of the state and its false promises is easy. So I want to start by laying this out, that while violence, particularly sexual violence, reverberates across our bodies, for some cisgender straight white men who perpetuate this violence, they win Oscars, the presidency, promotions, easy lives. Accountability and transformation is hard. So why so important to challenge this narrative of the sex offender? I want to give 3 reasons, and then I have 3 things we can do, and maybe I won't have time to do both of those. The first thing is, of course, it doesn't make us any safer. While there is no easy answer to what to do about people who sexually harm, particularly young people, research illustrates that our current system fails to deliver public safety. There is no research to suggest that the array of criminal and legal responses, including public registries and mandated reporting laws, have reduced sexual violence. And this category, sex offender, doesn't tell us much that can help us build movements to end sexual violence. This category encompasses a wide range of acts, from public urination to rape, and a myriad of charges reflect our attempts to untangle an unresolved thicket surrounding age, sexuality, and consent. Is a person convicted of lewd and lascivious behavior, a charge still levied against men who engage in public sex with other men, a danger? Can a 16-year-old consent to sexual activity? If a 14-year-old emails out naked photos of himself, is he distributing child pornography? These are needed public dialogues, and criminalization, which always falls on the most vulnerable, is not the response. The second reason why we want to challenge this narrative of the sex offender is our inability to include people with convictions for what the state calls violent crimes or sex offenses in our work to dismantle our nation's addiction to policing and punishment will ensure our failure. It is all of us or none of us, right? To quote Linda Evans and the many folks in the room attached to that. This was clearly illustrated throughout the Obama era, where criminal justice reform inched along but studiously avoided people with convictions for sex offenses. In fact, only 6 months after President Obama became the first sitting president to visit a federal prison, he signed a law requiring that the passports of anyone ever convicted of a crime of a sexual nature be emblazoned with the words sex offender. Directly and implicitly, their culpability and the violence formed the backdrop that justified relief for nonviolent offenders. Nationally, post-release, over 850,000 people are required to register as sex offenders and face increasing restrictions on employment, mobility, housing, and more. 20 states and the federal government have sexually violent predator laws that allow for the indefinite civil commitment of people with convictions for sex offenses after the completion of their prison sentences. Few such patients have ever been released. And if one category of people can be less than fully human for their real or imagined bad acts, so can others. Just ask the legions of young black men tarred as super predators in the 90s. So the third reason why we want to challenge this is beyond the individuals caged individually and indefinitely by this classification. The sex offender regime is one key affective engine of our carceral state, of our prison nation, built upon and reproduced by the politically manipulated emotion, revulsion, fear, vengeance, compounded by disinformation. This affective engine affects us all. Parks, schools, mass transit, and the internet are too dangerous for all of our children, and only continuous surveillance or police presence can adequately ensure their well-being. Enhanced criminal penalty zones surrounding schools and playgrounds all suggest the safety of certain children, but also function to extend and naturalize surveillance and policing. This affective regime doesn't promote child safety. It legitimizes a carceral state. Thinking about our bathroom bills there. So maybe I'll stop there and I'll leave my solutions or things we can do for a second round. Thank you.
Thank you. So when I began this work years ago, particularly after the work I did while I was in prison, I met a field that felt extremely politically correct and really enmeshed in using the language of the system to try to fight the system, the narrative of the system, the values of the system, and not really pushing the envelope. And so you open up in your presentation with the importance of not further marginalizing sex offenders, that this is not the third rail, that if you really want to build a movement, this is actually where you begin your work. And I think of sitting in a prison cell and learning about people like Eddie Ellis, who's no longer with us, but the courage I found in his willingness to come home from prison and stand up and be a leader, regardless of his experience in the criminal justice system. And that gave me a lot of strength. But then I stepped into a space that by definition lives in a country that is extremely patriarchal, that hetero cis men have helped to define the narrative, that hypermasculinity gets in the way, where even I, like a fish, doesn't understand that he's wet, didn't understand how me being a man in this country, in this space, got in the way of me doing the work in a way that was actually lending itself to movement building. And I'm trying to continue to be hypersensitive about that. I want you to talk, when I get back around to you, about the failure of the movement, to bring women into the space, and about the value of women being in the space to help define what the movement should look like. Because I've learned over the years through people like Donna and Kathy and Vivian and Aisha and Diana and Teresa and Andrea and other folks about what I get wrong as a man. And sort of accepting that and creating a space for listening to that and all the emotions that come with it, but then realizing that the more you invest in women is the more you invest in movement building. And so I'm going to come back to you and hope that you can sort of opine on that a bit. Yeah. So you guys know your questions. This is a lightning round. I'm glad we got through the first round. It was extremely emotional. Thanks for sharing. Let's see if we can get through this, because I want to open it up to the audience. I'm sure there's a bunch of questions out there. Humble?
So you mentioned in my story how I had shared the two roles of victim and offender, to use those terms. And I think in my mind, the way I envisioned it was to show that those of us who have taken part in crimes that are violent, and especially where a life was lost, something that you can never make up for and can never give back and can never really, make up for. I just wanted people to know that it wasn't that one day I woke up and decided, okay, I'm going to do this today, that there is a backstory, that human beings, exist in this, where we are affected, influenced by all of these other factors that come into play. In the non-traditional approach, we learned about these things, and we called them the crime generative factors, and that the crime generative factors then create in us this crime generative attitude. And being in the field of HIV, I learned about social determinants that play a role in how someone accesses healthcare. And I use that analogy in our field as well of criminal justice, in that there are also social determinants that play a role in you becoming first a victim and then a victimizer or an offender. And so I just wanted to share that.
So we have 3 minutes for this section for each
Yes.
of you. So I'm going to push you a little bit.
Okay.
So you are designing a criminal justice system from scratch, not the adversarial one that we have now that doesn't create space for that story, but a new one.
Yeah.
And what does that look like? Like, help me sort of wrap my head around. You end up with these handcuffs on for this crime. Where's the space for you to tell this story, for this to be part of the narrative and part of the process?
To piggyback a little on what my sister Aisha said, is that the space wasn't created and doesn't exist inside the prison system, specifically the New York State prison system, and of course, speaking from my experience in the men's prisons. So that's the only experience that I can share, being in the men's prisons for 14 years. It doesn't exist. It had to be created. It wasn't until we got together as people in prison and said, you know what, we need to create something that is centered on us. It has to be person-centered. It has to be community-specific. It has to be where it makes sense, because this theory of rehabilitation that has been in play for all the 40 years, it doesn't work for us because we are non-white, right? And it was meant for that people. So we have to take into account culture. We have to take into account our specific neighborhoods. And in those neighborhoods, what is really happening? And we wind up creating that for ourselves. And our study groups, our places where we worship became our therapy, became the place where within the system where we created that for ourselves. But it wasn't something that was there where the system says, you know what, you suffered trauma. Let's set up this space for you to speak to that trauma.
So I often say people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. It's fascinating for me that you guys, in a system that's not meant to create space for you to repair harm, created your own space for that to happen. While Aisha talked about these programs that exist, and I think the technical term was these bullshit programs, right? Yeah. So, okay, so I want to actually move on. Thank you, Humble. I want to move on to Aisha now. And I posed a pretty difficult question to you, which is what does the conversation look like between you and the loved ones of the victim of your crime if you had the chance to live that out?
Okay. First, Chanel, it's 12:05:92. If you need to get back in. I have been a poet for a very long time, and I've written a lot of poems. But I don't remember any of them. I remember one of them because I wrote it for the girl whose death I caused. So that's one of the ones that I remember. And it's my journey began as I ran through a list of books that my professor thought I should read. So I did concede, agreed and acquiesced at her behest to test the waters of knowledge. But crossing borders into college created in me a hesitation about my liberation from that broad and spacious road to destruction upon which I traveled even after I unraveled. My life and hers and theirs and his, the tears, the kids, the cops, the courts, the coroner, the cost, the loss of life. The light I made of it blinded me, and behind me was a darkness to which I could not see. So I pulled over on the shoulder of the road that is my mind, and I said, oh, man, this is where my real journey began. And it was after I had written that poem that I thought about the seriousness of actually what had happened. And if I had to have a conversation with Tasha's mother, I would, like my mother told me when she finally realized, like 5 years after I was in prison, like, Mommy, I killed someone. She just swore somebody else did it. She said she didn't raise a murderer. She didn't. And I would tell Tasha's family that there was nothing wrong with your daughter. She did nothing wrong. We were out there doing what we knew. And when somebody teaches you something, you live your life according to what you have been taught until you are old enough or wise enough to educate yourself and stop living in a certain way. But I would tell her that your daughter was not a monster. I don't care how many times she stabbed me. I don't care what her intention was. She did not deserve to die in the streets like that at all. And I would tell her mother that. And for people who, like me, I do believe in a resurrection, and I would like to see her again.
Thank you for sharing that poem, and thanks for responding to the question. Danielle, we were listening to John. What would he be saying to us about the message he was trying to send us?
So answering from my perspective is a little challenging because obviously I would not want him to have made that choice. Um, but I think what I can surmise in speaking for him is that, as I mentioned when I was speaking, he did everything in his power to show his remorse. Um, Things like never, forget it. It's too much of a tangent, but to show his remorse and to show that he was repenting for his crime, that he redeemed himself, and he really did. I mean, he was, as his lawyer had called him, the poster child for someone that should have gotten parole. And I think at 70, um, declining health, he was in a prison for a year that he had never been in before. That definitely contributed to his decline in health, the way he was treated there. I think he lost all hope, honestly, and just felt like he was forever going to be a cop killer, and that was it. And that brotherhood, the cop brotherhood runs deep, and that he was not ever going to be able to penetrate that. Um, and I think from a more personal side, I could say my sister and I were step sister or half sisters, sorry. We were kept apart our whole entire lives. We just met a little bit over a year ago. And it's absolutely amazing. But I think my father, as sad as it is, found some peace in that his family was finally together, and so really sending a message to change the narrative that he made this horrible choice. It had very devastating consequences, and that he did everything in his power to change that. If he had just passed away in prison, maybe the message wouldn't have been as strong. And so I think he really did that for everybody else that's in his shoes, in hopes of making change.
Thank you. You know, there's a ceremony in this country, in our criminal justice system, where at sentencing, it's very ceremonial. We redefine people, who they are, take away their citizenship, and banish them to places with high walls and prison towers, and we have no equal ceremony to bring people back up.
Mm-hmm.
We leave them there, and I think your courage in telling your dad's story actually creates a ceremony right here in this space to bring him back up, and so you're really courageous to be doing this. Thank you. So, Erica, the more I think about your question, the more I think about like what it takes to survive in jail and prison, and how tough you have to be. And I think of being on Rikers as a 16-year-old. I was stabbed 4 times. I was only there for 2 days, and then I went back for a year, and I became the bad person that was doing things to other people. And it felt like the right thing to do. If you go to gladiator school, you need to be a good gladiator.
Mm-hmm.
And here I come out, and I'm trying to lead this movement, and I'm standing on the shoulders of people like Eddie Ellis and other folks who learned everything that takes to survive in prison is the opposite of what it takes to not only survive out here, but to lead a successful movement. Mm-hmm. And then women come along, and they say, you know what, there needs to be space for us in leadership, and they challenge the men that are in that space. And it lands to me like, what? Like, you're saying I'm not doing the work. What are you saying about me? And it also makes me think about when I challenge other people on their privilege and what they need to be doing to align themselves with people of less privilege. And all this stuff is swirling in my head, and it's been in my head for the last few years. And I'm sort of trying to navigate showing leadership in this space, and at the same time creating the space for leadership for women. And I haven't figured it all out yet, and I'm still learning. And I just want to hear from you, just to continue to muse, because your presentation brought me right back into that space. So if you could just keep talking about failures of the movement, and what is the value of bringing other ideas, other people into the space, recognizing that, yes, this is a space that unfortunately has been led by men who came into this space bringing with them the survival skills from the system itself.
Mm-hmm. I mean, thanks for that. And I think we have also in the United States and globally a long history of. I mean, Angela Davis used the term abolition feminisms on Friday night, and while there's a track of kind of carceral feminists, largely white stream, um, women who have enabled our kind of law and order policies. We also have a radical trajectory from Ida B. Wells to Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, that have really had a trenchant critique of our prison nation, but also have really had strategies about how to build and dismantle the white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy. So I think that, which I love saying, I think it's important to keep saying that. If we're going to build and movements to end sexual violence, we need to dismantle white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy. So I don't know if I have the 3-minute answer to the smart question, but I think we can learn from those histories, right? From those organizing, whether it's the work of Insight, whether it's the work of Ida B. Wells, of abolitionist women of color, feminist organizing that has been at the forefront of critiquing and pushing for dismantling the carceral state, and at the same time demanding that we dismantle patriarchy, demanding that we end white supremacy, demanding that we end sexual violence.
Thank you. So we did a great job. First of all, round of applause for the panelists. So we started at 11:45. It's actually 11:51. I promised I'd keep space for the audience to ask questions. There's Marie. Where are you? 12:51. I'm sorry, 12:51. Is Marie in the audience? Right. Put your hand up. There you go. So we wanted to start with you. I think you were going to... Yeah, please. Can you use that microphone, please? And then we're going to open it up to the rest of the audience.
All right. So I want to talk about challenging the narrative, but just from a little different perspective. Is Danielle, it was hard talking as the second person, third person, whatever, right? But it was equally as hard for all of you to speak of your experiences. Is that safe to say? So what I wanted to bring up was the idea of when the loved one is murdered, which happened to my sister. So when Kathy was taken, and by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't say happy birthday, Kathy, yesterday. So we did have a birthday party for her, and obviously she wasn't there. But in trying to keep that memory alive, and I think you're going through a lot of that now in trying to keep your dad's memory and his hope of the future and all that. So I want to say that for all the lives that were lost out there, I mean, you guys did such an amazing job. Like, you talked about being vulnerable. You talked about addiction. You talked about lifestyles. You talked about basically picking up the pieces after what happened. And so many of those things parallel. You talked about education. My sister, before she was murdered, she had went back to school. She never got to complete her education because her life was taken. But I like the fact that you kept circling back to the idea that no one deserves to have their life taken. And that what you brought was humanity back into the room. I mean, I so appreciated that. And that we're all trying to remember life, and we're all trying to live life. And the more humanity we can bring back in the room, the more chance we have of doing that. Because a lot of times we just don't know what to do when that happens. Like, we don't know how to pick up the pieces. It's like, I can talk about a little narrative of just going to court and not even meeting. I didn't meet him. I never knew him, but now I was in a relationship with him, with the person that murdered my sister. Okay? And we were in this relationship even though we didn't know one another. But the big thing is just getting into the courtroom from your perspective. I mean, how you felt when the media was always a hard thing. So today I'm still camera shy. I'm still very shy about this. I thank my sister because I know she's got to be sitting on my shoulder or I wouldn't be able to do this. So I just want you to know that the life's really parallel. I mean, it really parallels the whole process. And that just as much as the inside tends to fail those that go inside, the outside tends to fail the people that are left here to pick up the pieces to what happened to their life. And that includes your families. I mean, your families. I mean, everyone is impacted by the violence. So
Thank you for
I don't
sharing.
know if that's helpful.
No, that was extremely valuable for bringing that additional perspective into the conversation. Thank you. So I'm going to take questions, recognizing that I've actually had my back to this side of the room most of the time. I apologize for that as I was engaging the panelists. So let's start from here and go in this direction. I'm going to ask people to ask a question, to not make a statement, and for one panelist to respond to each question so we get as many questions in as possible. Can you stand up and start with your name, please?
Hi, my name is Belita, and thank you all for being here. And my question is in regards to being an educator and understanding that I have privileges that I don't necessarily can connect with my kids. How can I create spaces where it's not necessarily like they're afraid to come to me because they know that I might have to report because I'm mandated, right? And also kind of at the same time be able to not just be like, well, I did this and that's the end of it, right?
Anybody want to take that on? So let me, if I get it correctly, so how do you create a space where the people that you are providing a service to feel freely to open up to certain things that they know that you may have to report to them, being a mandatory reporter? Mandated, I'm also trained as a mandated reporter as well, and so the first thing that we have to look at is the safety of the person. And so definitely if it's a child and the child is being abused, we have to make sure that this child is protected. If it's a person who is suicidal or has suicidal or homicidal thoughts, we have to make sure that we play due diligence and play a role in protecting that person, making sure this doesn't happen. It's not an easy task. It's not an easy task. The only way I have been successful in my field and working with people where they open up to me is I try to balance and share some of my personal experiences. So I'm an indigenous social worker, right? Because I came up in the street. I know what it is to be poor, to be hungry, to be addicted to drugs, to be victimized. I know what that is. And so I open up and I disclose in certain situations when I know that is helpful. But at the same time, I know that I have to be a mandated reporter and protect them, because in the bottom line, you're protecting them. But I think that as long as they can see that in your heart, you are authentic and that you really care about their well-being, and even if you have to report them, they know that you're only doing it because you want to protect them. And so I just wanted to thank you, because I can see it in your eyes and in your statement that you really care about what you do. And the bottom line, the only thing that really works for us is love. The only way an evidence-based intervention is going to be successful to this human being is when that human being is treated as a human being and is loved. That's the only thing that works. And so I know that you have it, and I wanted to thank you for that too.
With no judgment, just
Exactly.
to add.
No judgment.
Yes.
Thank you.
If I may, Glenn, add that just like I told the Manhattan District Attorney the other day, every kid that does something or commits a crime does not need to be arrested
Or punished.
There are alternatives to everything that everyone does. Once even if you beat a case or it gets dismissed, you've been through the system, you've been stabbed 4 times in 2 days, you've ruined their life. You have ruined it. So if you, without violating your reporting, your mandatory reporting, can help that kid, you help him. You do everything that you can besides report him.
As my friend Danielle Sred says, the most longstanding diversion program in America is white skin and privilege. Suddenly we're worried about how we can do it for people of color. Let's keep going. So from this side of the room, moving across, there's a question in the back here. Oh, there's a question up here in the front.
Trying to be real quick. Find language to be extremely important. And so how do we move and change language in ourselves and in other people to move from offender, cop killer, what have you, to which are labels that dehumanize us, stigmatize us, to talking about what's happened and how we responded to situations that develop and bring forth our humanity, such as formerly incarcerated people as opposed to offenders and so on and so forth.
Anyone want to respond to that?
I think people are going to call us what they choose to call us. What you answer to is the issue. And when you are incarcerated, there's absolutely nothing you can do about how they treat you in prison. There's nothing you can do about it while you're there. ILC is a joke. Grievance is a joke. Everything in prison is a joke. There's nothing. You can't fix anything. The trick is to get out of prison and just tear the walls down from the outside. And to do that, and to do that, and to do that, and to do that.